let's jump back about a year when the Open California Board heard from staff what the planned conferences were going to be for the year. And it's tough because they come up with a schedule of usually 4 big conferences, including conferences and special events like Top 100. And we were pretty certain that wildfires would still be an issue this year. So Friday marks the 1-year anniversary to the day of the breakout of the Camp Fire that largely destroyed Paradise that we all know too well, as well as the Woolsey Fire in Southern California, Los Angeles, and Ventura counties. There's been a lot of finger pointing in the last couple of weeks, and certainly this conference was scheduled well before there were things to point fingers at. But I think that we've got an outstanding panel, this one and the subsequent ones in our lunchtime keynote from CAL FIRE, to really take a step back from the media accounts of who did this, who did that, and what, and hear from various stakeholders. The most important figure after last week's disasters, and fires are still burning. Kincaid's at 88% containment and has burned 77,758 acres. The Maria fire near Santa Paula, as of last night, was 9,999 acres. Fortunately, that one has had minimal damage because it's largely been on the mountain adjacent to, or 20 miles, I think, outside of Santa Paula. But it's important to remember that in 2017, 2018 combined, we had 130 deaths associated with wildfires that had some electrical component. They will be fighting in court and for years, and some of the panelists can talk about how some of these things play out of exactly what liability will be. And I look forward to getting into that. But 130 deaths, 2017, 2018, and 0 this year. That's remarkable work by all stakeholders. Obviously, first and foremost, CAL FIRE and their brothers and sisters that are on the front lines, other public safety entities, local government, and PG&E. As much as people don't want to say, well, PG&E has done some good stuff, they really did do some good stuff that made this year's destruction and the absence of deaths possible. So with that, I'm not going to go through long introductions of our speakers because you have them in your book, and I know that we've got a lot to talk about in the next 50 minutes. We're going to save the last 10 minutes or so for questions. So write down questions that you might have for the panel to ask during that time. And when we get to that, and I'll try to remember to remind you, wait for the microphone to be brought around you so that your question, whether you want it or not, will be recorded for audio and video purposes. So to my immediate left is somebody that proves that there is life after the legislature, and that is Rich Gordon, representing the California Forestry Association. And to his left, I'm like, I guess I should look, is Laurie Wayburn, who represents the Pacific Forest Trust, which is my understanding, I'm gonna ask each to give a quick elevator pitch on their organization, but works on conservation easements in forested areas. And to her left is Brian Rice of the California Professional Firefighters. Again, thank you for the hard work of all of your members. And to the furthest left, or I'm sorry, Mike, we have to Brian's left, we have Rex Frazier of the Personal Insurance Federation of California. And finally, my friend of 25 years, Patrick McCallum from the Victims Group, Up From the Ashes. So why don't we start by just an elevator pitch of what your organization is, who you represent, so that it contextualizes our discussion. Let me start with you.
Sure. So again, Rich Gordon with the California Forestry Association. We represent the companies in California that grow trees, produce lumber. In California, all of those companies are family-owned. We do not have any publicly traded companies in California, no international companies in California. They're all local family-based companies operating in California making lumber.
Pacific Forest Trust is dedicated to conserving and managing forests for all their values, including public trust values as well as private benefits. And we work in California, Oregon, and Washington. And a key tool that we use is developing sources of financial return for landowners for managing for public trust benefits.
Hi, I'm Brian Rice. I'm president of the California Professional Firefighters. We represent 32,000 professional firefighters in the state of California. That's everybody from CAL FIRE to almost every municipal fire department in between. We do a lot of law and legislation. The last 2 years have very much found us with our 501c3 or our charity, the California Fire Foundation. We have been very active and will continue to be so in not only community recovery, but assistance to communities with either hard assets, education, education materials, and presence on the ground. So we put them out, and we've also involved ourselves with the communities that are hurt.
Thank you, Brian.
Good morning. I'm Rex Frazier, president of the Personal Insurance Federation of California. We represent large property casualty insurance companies, so that would be auto, home, earthquake, flood insurance issues, obviously homeowners insurance issues for today. We represent a mix of shareholder-owned companies and non-shareholder-owned companies. You might have heard the term mutual, so that's more like a co-op than a shareholder-owned company on their public policy issues.
I'm Patrick McCallum. I have a lobbying firm, McCallum Group, Inc. 2 years ago, I picked up a client, Up for the Ashes, which is the 43 law firms representing not only the northern 20 fires of 17, 18, 15, but the Southern California fires and the victims, the wildfire victims that they represent.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to start actually with Rex because we do have some numbers from this year's fires, and we talked offline a little bit about this and the magnitude. It looks like around 390 structures destroyed and hundreds more damaged this year. Can you contextualize that with what we saw in 2017 and 2018?
Yes, 2017 and 2018, from an insurance perspective, were simply unheard of events. In the last 2 years, insured losses exceeded $25 billion. And whether or not they're started by a third party like a utility, the homeowners insurance companies are responsible for stepping up immediately, fulfilling their contracts, and starting that difficult process of recovery and rebuilding. While the Kincaid fire specifically was an enormous event, it was a terrorizing fire, but from an insurance perspective, it was not a tremendous property loss, and to my knowledge, there hasn't been a fire-related death. So it was certainly scary, but in the insurance industry, the last 2 years have been really starting off a fundamental rethink of the exposure that we face in California for catastrophic wildfire risk. I think before those 2 years, the insurance industry thought it had an exposure that it now knows it has a dramatically larger exposure. It would be like, let's say you're an auto insurance company and you think that you are insuring an elderly couple driving a slow Oldsmobile down the street, and your rate level is much lower because that's who you think you're insuring, but it turns out you're insuring a teenage boy driving a Mustang and on social media while he's driving, and you realize you have no idea what you're insuring, and you have to fundamentally change your approach because your rates are based on assumptions that are untrue. And truly, there's a fundamental global rethink of catastrophic wildfire in California.
You noted that there appear to have been no fire-related deaths. There was one of an elderly man that was oxygen dependent. There was kind of a debate, and that some media outlets right away said, it was a PG&E, death. But that was from after autopsy. It was pretty much determined that this person likely would have passed, whether the power was on or not. But people talk about the fires and they think about the structures that burn down. But you have both the structure side and the life insurance side that you have to deal with. So does that make the insurance exposure for this year, not just in the significantly fewer structures destroyed, but apparently no lives, does that reduce the exposure to your clients?
Well, I think we are trying to get our hands around the risk, and obviously moving forward, we all have to share in figuring out what it's going to take to reduce the risk of wildfire. I'm sure Rich will be Rich will be talking about issues related to how we reduce risk related to fuels. And Brian will be talking about how, approaches that we can take to mitigate risks that humans and structures face. But in the insurance world, rates are based upon past losses. And if losses continue to rise, rates continue to rise. And we should all be united in figuring out what's going to be reducing the risk of whether it be property loss or loss of life. That's our task in front of us.
Thank you, Rex. Brian, obviously we were all watching the Kincaid fire, because it was so close to large populations. Paradise last year was not close to a large population, but it just broke out so quickly and, took those small communities with it. Can you share anything about the Kincaid fire? I know that, there were kind of two edges that were being very closely watched and defended. Highway 101 on the western side, after which, if the fire burned, it may have gone all the way to the Pacific, and Mount St. Helena, which is a major communications infrastructure on the east side of the fire. Can you share a little bit about your members' experiences the last couple of weeks?
The easiest way to put it, the Kincaid fire, we were all damn lucky. And with any of these fires, there's several things in there that played in. The Kincaid fire, although it did impinge on population bases in the Sonoma area, it largely was outside of those bases. But the one thing that none of us can control is the weather. And we all know that we had some pretty significant weather, wind events during the height of the Kincaid fire. Some of the things that have helped, and I believe you said Director Porter will be speaking at lunch, and I know that he will touch on it a lot more in depth. Some of the things that the general population doesn't know, one, we were lucky where the footprint of it was. Most people were out of harm's way. The firefighters that were put on that were able to go for direct physical defense, putting the fire out. You talk about Paradise, you talk about the Carr fire, you talk about the Woolsey fire. Firefighters didn't have much, if any, direct fire attack on those fires because you were moving people, lives. They literally were saving lives in the first 12 to 24 hours. A lot of the other things, and I think it is bearing a lot of fruit for us, is the technology that's being applied. You go back to the Atlas tubs. Most people don't know this, but CAL FIRE was able to employ, they're probably a generation or two back, essentially Predator drones out of the military. Beale Air Force Base operated them, and some of the things that they were able to do, and specifically we'll take Yountville, where the Veterans Home is, that was a pretty active edge of the fire, and some of this technology allowed the incident commanders in CAL FIRE working with those folks to track the thermal hotspots, both night and day, and where the danger points were, and they were able to let a few places of the line be less attended and focus resources directly into the hotspots or the biggest threats. So there's a lot of things that played in for us at Woolsey, Kincaid. Probably the biggest part was it was outside of the major population bases, and we had essentially a buffer zone.
Patrick, I believe you were without power some of last week in Santa Rosa, and can you share a little bit of a victim's perspective, both obviously in 2017 and then again for a different reason this year?
So my wife and I are Tubbs fire victims. We woke up at 4:02 in the morning with half the house on fire and essentially ran with clothes that we had on for 15 minutes, and were saved by 2 firemen. I wouldn't be here today if not for those 2 firemen, and I wouldn't be here today if not for the grit that my wife had to get up the hill to do it. We decided not to rebuild, lost the house, lost everything. We live about 10 miles from the Kincaid fire, so we experienced it intimately and directly. Our power went out, our generator went out. It's not fun to be part of, those of you that do that. It's also when you are a victim, your PTSD carries with you. So for the victims, and so I represent victims, my story is about victims, wildfire victims, and their In California, about 140,000 utility-caused wildfire victims in the last 4 years, if you include the Butte fire. So it aggravates your PTSD. You could smell the smoke, you can feel it. But the story, I think, is that we are far safer today because of camp and tubs than we would have been. So start with the fact that there was an analytic system in the Kincaid fire that was quicker and faster. So they had the cameras and everything else. The true heroes on this were the 5,000 firemen. They were heroic in what they did. I mean, it was a battle, and they saved Windsor, and they saved Hillsburg, maybe Sonoma, parts of Mount Santa Elena. We could see the fire from our house within it. So incredible. They got there faster, they're quick. The equipment, they have more equipment, not enough, but more equipment, so within it. So if you really look at the conditions that we have, very rainy prior winter, it's been 6 months since we've had rain, 70, 80-mile gusts within it. It's really incredible, the story that we didn't even have more damage. So a story about technology, a story about when problems happen. It was a combination of SB 901, 1054, and this judge in San Francisco named Judge Alsop that was ordered PG&E to be with very specific directions of what they need to do, invest money within it. So we have a long ways to go, but I think the system's in place to create a safer California, whether the insurance industry, whether the investment industry in PG&E, whether the housing industry or the population trust it or not, but we're certainly safer than we were 2 years ago.
Do you feel that the notices from PG&E for the public safety power shutoff, which is pretty much a new process for PG&E in Southern California Edison, but something that San Diego Gas and Electric has done for quite some time, 48-hour notice, 24-hour notice, maps, and
October 9th, 2017, our notice was a smoke alarm going off. The Friday night, we had literally every 30 minutes between my phone or my wife's phone or the home phone ringing. So the cell phone towers there was enough batteries within the cell phone, so we were properly notified. So they've got that under. Now, if the cell phone tower burns down, there's a problem, and they've got a battery storage problem that they're going to have to figure out. So I think that's the next step that the cities and counties and state are going to have to look at.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to go to Rich and Laurie, and when the panels were assembled, we were all thinking forest because of 2017, 2018, but these really weren't forest fires the way we think of them, or they're more like the brush fires I grew up with in Orange County when Anaheim Hills and the Brea Canyons would burn. I'll start with Laurie for gender. You're equal, but I was going to go to Laurie. And are things on the ground much different? I asked Patrick about PG&E and notification of the power shutoffs, but how much has changed on the ground with both the private landowners you work with and what you see across the landscape?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that remembering that historically, before fire suppression, roughly 5 million acres a year in California burned across all of our vegetation types. Grasslands, oak woodlands, chaparral, and conifer forests. Mm-hmm. Fire is part of California. Mm-hmm. And as Patrick says, you need to approach it systemically and not just symptomatically. And much of what we're seeing is this extraordinarily brave response of people on the ground fighting fires when they occur. But systemically, we need to do the same things with nature the same way we are with technology, and look systemically at how we can reestablish fire-resilient landscapes so that we reduce the intensity of fires. And that's across the board. And CAL FIRE is doing a terrific job in reestablishing its prescribed fire program. So the effort is really to get fire back as safely as possible on the landscape, because fire is here. If you will, fire and the state of our state is a little bit like human health. When you have a variety of problems, you want to stabilize immediately, but then you want to change your lifestyle to have a healthy, safe life. And on the ground, we are putting in place both some of the long-term tools that we need, like fuels reduction across the board in the vegetation types. We are putting in place prescribed fire. We need to address our land use patterns. We really do. The outgoing head of CAL FIRE, Ken Pimlott, when he left, said, we have got to address the issue of building in places we shouldn't build. And it's a hard thing to do, but that is something we absolutely have to do because in fire parlance, a house in the middle of the WUI is an ignition source. And nobody's bad here, but we just have to make some smarter decisions around land use.
And I'm sure we'll come back to it, but Rex shared with me a map yesterday of the city of Santa Rosa, and it had the Tubbs fire overlaid on the 1964 fire,
Yes,
and they're almost identical.
yes.
And, that's what, and it probably, we hate to say it, but in 40 or 50 years, there probably would be an identical, even with like the perfect
Absolutely.
the perfect infrastructure, the best firefighters in the country, we could be facing exactly the same thing again, just based on the history we know.
Well, that's true. And it's also true in some of the areas such as forest management. When you look at the rim fire in the American Canyon, that was burning over an area that had been burned several times before. And one of the critical things we need to do, both in the building arena, is look at some of those structural incentives that encourage people to do what they've already done where you've experienced those disasters. We know that in forests, having a more fire-resilient landscape requires having older, larger trees that are better spaced. So that thick bark of the older trees is fire-resistant. The better spacing is the fire will drop down to the ground. Whereas if we have heavily stocked, uniform forests, those are very susceptible to fire and other stresses of climate change. So we need to have some systemic changes that are looking to that long term, recognizing that California is naturally a fire state. And that's something that, whether it's our insurance policies, whether it's our transportation policies, whether it's our land use policies and our land management incentives, those need to shift to adapt.
Well, at that point, California is a fire-prone state. I dated a girl in college who's actually a wildlife biologist for U.S. Forest Service based out of Portland.
Yeah.
And like one of the main parts of her role is going in and doing the assessment after wildfires. And, the human tragedy is awful. It's the kind of stuff I report on every day, following all the reports. But then she would sit back and say, on your point about where we build, she said, the fire helps the critters, because that's what she focuses on. And so we have these competing things.
Some fires help critters.
Right.
Low intensity natural regime fires help critters. They also are incredibly good at controlling diseases and exotic pests and exotic plants that we do not want in our landscapes. So think of it as you want a really healthy diet, right? You don't want to be gorging and then throwing up. It's kind of like what we've done. We've suppressed fire, and then boom, when it breaks out, it's really intense. But naturally speaking, and I want to recommend this to everybody in the audience, Native Americans used fire to shape the landscape. And there are some magnificent chants out of different tribes that talk about the seasons of the oaks. They're all based on getting fire on the landscape to reduce conifer competition, to encourage native grasses, to reduce pests and diseases. And that is what encourages the base of the food chain in terms of the kind of foods that we want, the insects, the birds, the wildlife. And so we need fire on this landscape, but we need it more safely.
So Rich, why didn't you rake your forests? No, I know that major changes have been made. There were changes in policy in SB 901 that was passed on the last night of session as to what trees homeowners and others could harvest, diameter, those kinds of things. You know a hell of a lot more about than I do. But there were major steps taken. And like with PG&E and the notices with the public safety power shutoffs, we saw that some things got up and running, but addressing neglect in our forests at whoever's blamed takes a lot longer. So have we made meaningful progress since last year?
Probably not. I mean, I think what progress we've made has been minimal. CAL FIRE has done, or is completing 35 fuel break projects around high-risk communities. But one of the challenges, even with the revised regulations that came in SB 901, particularly as it would relate to fire prevention thinning, is the ownership of the land. 60% of the forests in California are owned by the federal government. And they have historically not been engaged in management over the last several decades. And so those forests are problematic for us and need attention. The only 3% of our forests are owned by state and local governments. The balance are owned privately. And most of that acreage is in smaller landowners. And many of those folks find financial challenges in figuring out how to thin and manage their lands, and liability risks of bringing onto their lands the prescribed fire that Laurie talks about, which is really essential as a management tool. So we still have a ways to go. I mean, I think it's important to understand that we've been suppressing fire in California, a natural phenomenon. We've been suppressing it for over a century. And it will take a while to turn this around in terms of the management of our vegetation. And I do also want to stress that it is not just a conifer problem. This is a vegetation management problem for California, whatever the vegetation type. We just, too much, we've not had the kind of natural fires that are necessary. So I think it's going to take a while.
I just lost my train of thought. I was gonna turn to Rex. I think it's technically on the panel. I was reading through the panels. I think it's technically in the rebuilding, but obviously your members are kind of feeling the heat of withdrawing from providing coverage in certain fire-prone areas, whether it be for rebuilding of fire-prone areas or within fire-prone areas, or just preventative for future such disasters. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. It's hard to think of withdrawing because in California, the way the law works, everybody has a right to fire insurance in California that is not funded by the government, but rather is provided by the insurance industry. What we all think of as regular insurance, in our language, voluntary market or admitted market insurance companies, that's the frontline market. But if someone cannot find insurance, there's a program called the California Fair Plan. That's not a government program. That is the insurance industry. And the statute, it actually says it's a non-voluntary association of insurance companies. So you're compelled as a licensed insurance company in California, in order to write in the voluntary market, you have to join the Fair Plan. And if the Fair Plan, they just take orders. You can go to them and say, I would like homeowners insurance, or I would like fire insurance, and they will say, yes, how much? So there's a right to fire insurance in California by the private insurance industry. And if the Fair Plan runs out of money, they don't get to go to the budget process and ask for an appropriation. Their appropriation is, if they, let's say, have $1 billion fire, they would go to the homeowners insurance industry on a market share basis and say, stroke me a check. So in that case, if it was $1 billion event, they would go to the largest market share company, State Farm, which writes 18% of the voluntary market, and they would say, please write us a check for $180 million. I know you've never collected premium at all for this risk, but we would really like that check, chop chop. So there is, now obviously that's going to be higher priced because this is by its very definition a pool of homes that can't find insurance in the voluntary market. So just as think of all the debates we had around the ACA, when you're dealing with a pool of risks that are by definition high risk, the average price is going to be higher. So no one wants to go to the Fair Plan, and that's why it's called the residual market or the market of last resort. But if the Fair Plan is growing, it's a sign of something that's going wrong in the voluntary market. That's the conversation that we certainly want to have. And as I noted before, I think the insurance industry has a rate level that's based on a different understanding than today's reality, and that's undoubtedly going to be a big discussion moving forward.
Tying your comments together with those of Laurie and Rich about, the difficulty of landowners of actually taking the steps necessary to build resilience around their property, are there incentives that insurers do, Rex, that encourage such proactive measures like we see with health insurers and auto insurers? That sort
You
of
bet. There's lots of things embedded into rates, and they have been for years, building materials first and foremost. And certainly the 2008 statewide building codes were a huge advance for fire safety. And so if you can go online to an insurance company and all you do is change year of construction, if your home is built now versus a home built in the 60s, the dramatic premium reduction is immediately evident. I will say fire science is not where it needs to be for purposes of assessing risk. If you think back, the first advance in science was really in the hurricane context, 1991, Hurricane Andrew. 11 insurance companies were bankrupted by that storm. And of course, there was a lot of interest in figuring out the nature of this wind risk. And it led to a lot of dislocation in the short term, but ultimately you can now say with pretty good confidence what it takes to harden a building for wind. And then we had the Northridge earthquake, and all of a sudden we learned that the earth moves in different ways than all the modeling predicted. And that led to the commencement of 20 years plus of advanced earthquake science, where now the California Earthquake Authority has a program that relies upon 3 simple things that an individual can do to harden their structure, and it will make a meaningful reduction in the risk of loss. We're nowhere there yet for fire. I think we all hope to be. But there were homes in Paradise that were brick and aluminum roof that burned, right? So there's a lot of luck that goes into which structure will ignite and which won't. And at this point, while the insurance industry, along with many others, have been encouraging all sorts of home hardening, defensible space, regional community certification for fire reduction, there's a long way to go, and there's certainly not a data set where you can say if you do X, Y, and Z, your home is going to survive a fire. Because truly, these fires, if you've ever been in a Santa Ana or in a Sundowner in Santa Barbara or in Diablo Winds, it is unreal what it's like until you've been in it and you feel the hot wind that is out of control, and to think that individuals on their own property can do something to stop what that fire is going to do. It's unreasonable to think that.
Patrick, people like to talk about the different sides, and it often gets confused when we talk about these issues. It's, for example, the wrestling of control of PG&E is between shareholders on one side, debt holders on another side, and then public entities that want to take it over, all battling it out. But victims, and you mentioned victims and law firms representing victims and insurance companies are oftentimes on the same side in this debate, because insurance companies pay out to their shareholders, but they have the legal right
To their policyholders.
Did I say shareholders? See, I can, debt holders, all that crap. But they have the right, if indeed PG&E, for example, was negligent, to seek subrogation to get their payouts back. What's it been like to, kind of an unholy alliance, if you will?
This is right here. So the unholy alliance started about 2 years ago when PG&E tried to get rid of inverse condemnation. I assume everybody knows what that is. We don't have to do. But the coalition was a coalition of wildfire victims and the law firms, the insurance industry, the cities, the counties, and the consumer attorneys. And it was a tough battle, but that victory was done to protect the constitutional rights of cities, counties, and homeowners around liability that takes place. So that's what that coalition was about. When the action isn't here in Sacramento now, when it comes to PG&E, the action's in San Francisco. There are, I guess you said there are 3 groups. There could be 4 or 5 groups, depending on it is. but there's a group of the equity holders who are the stockholders that's connected with PG&E, and they cut a deal with the insurance industry for $11 billion. And at the same time they cut that deal, they took about $5 billion off the table for wildfire victims. At that point, the second group, which is the debtors, and they're all hedge funds. There are 18 or 20 hedge funds on each side. They just have to be debtors or equity holders. In fact, when you talk to them, they actually own stock, debt, day trade, buy subrogation insurance. These hedge funds are involved in this economic play of PG&E in all different ways within it. But we, the tort victims, are the lawyers that are representing wildfire victims, at that point said, we're not getting any kind of movement with PG&E. We then went and negotiated a deal with the bondholders, which provided about $13.5 billion for wildfire victims. The judge then said 2 weeks ago, you tort victims need to negotiate with the equity holders, and we are in mediation. In fact, we're in mediation today. And this is, I think that we're looking for a quicker solution. I think there's some positive news that is coming out of the negotiations, and it's all about getting wildfire victims as quickly as possible. The public option is a legitimate option. New York Times did an analysis of this about a year, almost a little less than 2 years ago. And they looked at investor-owned utilities and public utilities. And the simple conclusion was the public utilities were safer and cheaper, but the investor-owned utilities had better customer service. That was sort of what took within that. And I probably think that's about right. So the public option, given everything with PG&E, is a legitimate option, but it's 6 months, 8 months, probably too late. Wildfire victims can't wait at this point. I think the governor's serious about it. If we don't come to an agreement in the next month or two, then they're seriously looking at a public option. But you're talking about $25 billion of liability. On top of that, you have to buy out the shareholders, which is today's price is $9 or $10 per stock, probably looking at about $20 billion worth of costs within that. And then also make a commitment to do the infrastructure safety changes that need to be done. So unlikely, though a legitimate, I think, look at public policy, and you can certainly, a public entity, and you can certainly understand why that is, the cities have picked up on it. I don't see a piecemeal approach to this. If you have a group of hedge funds putting $40 billion in the company, it doesn't make sense to sell off your best entities like San Francisco or San Jose within that. They're going to want the revenue on going forward. So that sort of plays the different entities, and wildfire victims do have a major say in this. And at this point, it's oriented in the bondholders, but you could also see maybe a deal with the equity in the bondholders, and maybe there's some public side of it. All those issues are on the table for negotiation.
Has there been a price tag for any of you identified for like the 10-year cost of hardening the grid, raking, clearing trees, changing out equipment, and those sorts of things? Because I haven't really seen that in the various discussions about bankruptcy of which financial holes we're filling. We've got 17, 18 liabilities. You've got the existing shareholders. You've got existing debt. But where is the hardening of the grid or replacement of the grid, if you will?
Well, I would refer to Brian's expertise on this. I think it's critical within this, and I've become a little bit better understanding on it. But
I was going to call on him, too.
The critical question is going to be the undergrounding. If you go underground, it's $1.3 million per mile. My understanding is you don't need to go underground everywhere. You need to go underground some places. In some places, you need to replace poles with steel poles. The infrastructure, they were criminal, PG&E, in what they didn't do in investing in a safer grid in the last 25 years. And we all are suffering for that. I think 1054 goes a long way. It does require $5 billion of investment. Is that enough? No. But the critical part of 1054 is accountability mechanism that's in place. So they have to get certified every year. Judge Alsop has sort of created the recommendations. So you're starting with more specific, the most targeted areas, the most vulnerable areas first in the next 3 years, and then you get into the forest and all the rest. But I think that, you know, if we want to get to where San Diego Electric is with PG&E, Johnson says 10 years, I've heard 5 to 10 years, but with the accountability in place, we know it can be more focused. And that we won't just see a year or two investment, this is going to go on over the next 10 or 12 years.
Brian, did you want it? Brian and then Laurie, and then we're going to do a lightning round, and then it's Q&A time. So think of your questions, Brian.
Just a couple of quick things, and please don't take this as offensive. But and I learned this through the burn community, and people that have had burn injuries, they're not victims, they're survivors. And I think we need to, you are a burn survivor. You lost your home, you lived through it, and it really hit home to me. My brother didn't lose his home in the tubs, but came very close. And when he called to talk, and I told him, you're not a victim, you're a survivor. It puts you, it's a building frame of mind. That's a very simple thing. If you went through these, you are a survivor, not a victim. That's part of the conversation change. I think that another piece, and this really struck me, I attended an event that was the opening of fire season back in May. Some very, very high-level officials, and spoke, for the most part, honestly, and really looking at the situation. But the one thing that struck me was the director of the U.S. Forest Service, and we're talking about the West, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, was very, very proud, and I don't want to take away from him, he should be, that the Forest Service performed vegetation reduction and management on 384,000 acres in California. And everybody went, there's 58 million more acres. Let's be honest with Californians. We have a problem. And we have a greater population than we've ever had. We have impinged in our mountainous areas more than ever, and it's not going to stop. So we have to make it safe. And I've seen a couple of things that have happened, and one is, and it's partnerships. And I've talked to the governor about this. Initially, I was very concerned about the forest industry. I have a very high level of comfort with what the association wants to do and how they want to go about it. We can't save every tumbleweed. We can't save every, we just can't. But we also can't log old growth forests. We have to be smart. We learned our lesson. And it's about partnerships. A person, and this is going on all over, and believe it or not, PG&E has funded a lot of these at a local level. We have to build on these. I'll take one person, Bruce Schaff, who has a degree in forestry management, was a firefighter, and he started a project on his property, 15 acres in Pollock Pines, and he did a scientific fuel reduction using the mastication process. Cost him $1,900. He partnered, I don't know if he partnered with an insurance group or utility to do it. We're thinking very big, and we're missing the small pieces of this, that if we engage Californians, if we engage the insured, very much like the utilities did with upgrading your HVAC, upgrading your windows, being more solar conscious, we have to be more vegetation conscious when we live in these areas. We haven't even scratched the surface yet. Our governor has put over $1 billion into wildland response and preparedness. And one of the things that I saw him do, I was with him at the campfire, and he listened to one of the survivors, and she was elderly, and she said, we didn't know. And I watched that man. I watched the change in him. He was pissed. How can we have a system where we can't let people that are in danger know? And I believe that one little instance had a difference on the Kincaid and the Maria and the Easy and all of those. This is a across-the-board problem with not one answer, and partnerships for us as firefighters that we'd have never made, not in a million years. We can't look at it like that anymore. They're government, private industry, utility, municipalities, Our partnerships are not as strong as they need to be, and that's what's going to make this work.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to change up the scheduling, if you will, a little bit as our minutes wane. So if you have a question, go ahead and put your hand up. John Howard's got a microphone, but then I'm going to turn to Laurie, but I want the panelists, our closing question is going to be, what would you do with a magic wand in the 1 year time span and a 10-year time span? So think about that, and Laurie.
I'll just very briefly say that we need to be able to move our thinking from going, gosh, isn't that great? We put $1 billion into this over 5 years. If you think about the insured losses of $25 billion for 1 year, we need to be investing at a factor of 10 to 100 of what we are investing now proactively, because it will be a fraction of the cost later. So we need to be putting on the ground something like $10 billion a year or $25 billion over 5 years to change how our vegetation is managed and to provide the incentive to landowners and to communities to be more fire safe.
I hear somebody
and that will
yelling.
also be climate-wise.
I hear somebody yelling, high-speed rail right about now.
Well, you're absolutely right. Shift the incentives to what we really need. And we need to be investing in our natural landscape's resilience. It'll benefit us for fire, for human health, for climate change, for water. It's an incredibly cost-effective investment, but it can't be in the 100 millions or even the single-digit billion. It needs to be in the double and triple digit.
John, I think we have a question right over here.
Hi, my name is Four Waters. I'm with the California Rural Voice, and my question's for Rex. My understanding, and I could be wrong, is that the assessment that insurance companies are making now, especially in fire vulnerable communities, is not home by home, but more community by community. And that a homeowner who has gone through all of the effort and considerable cost to harden their home or put defensible space in place can still be assessed based on the region around them. And I'm wondering if you would just take a couple minutes to both speak to that, if I'm correct, and then how are we going to deal, with those communities where somebody who quite likely could live on a fixed income made a substantial investment to protect themselves and then finds that they have no homeowners insurance?
Yeah, and there's no doubt. We encounter it all the time. Individuals want to feel control over their own destiny, and they want to be able to say, well, I did X, Y, and Z, therefore shouldn't I either pay less for insurance, or shouldn't I have some sort of obligation that if I go to an insurance company, they have to say yes to my application. You know, there are 100 homeowners insurance companies in California, and each one operates differently. The law doesn't say that you can just go to any insurance company and say, I've done X, Y, and Z. You must enter into a contract with me, is not the state of the law. I think the hardest part for insurers is in assessing the risk. There's no tool, public or private, that's available that is able to say if an individual does this on their property, they have fundamentally changed their risk of an insured loss. That tool just simply doesn't exist. There are a lot of things that make that difficult. Obviously, when an ember can fly a half a mile or a mile and land in a vulnerable spot on a home, you start saying, well, defensible space, we encourage it. Home hardening, we encourage it. Regional work, we encourage it, but that's no guarantee that ember is not going to find a way to start a fire. It may not be on your property. It may be on your next door neighbor's property. And certainly what someone's done on their own property doesn't guarantee what their neighbor has done or their neighborhood has done. And all of a sudden you have home transmission, which the dominant source of fire is embers. But if you look at Coffey Park, that was a house-to-house transmission. And at some point, again, in Paradise, there was a home that was a cinder block and metal roof that exploded from the inside. So we certainly encourage people. Pricing mechanism is one way to do that. I think the hard part for insurers is we get asked questions a lot about, well, shouldn't there be a discount for doing X, Y, and Z? And that's asking an industry that believes that the average rate in California is significantly where it needs to be. The average homeowner's premium in California is 1/2 of what it is in Louisiana. And last time I checked, Louisiana is not a high-priced state compared to California. It costs a whole lot more to build a home in California than it does in Louisiana, but yet their homeowners' prices, average premium is twice of what it is in California. You know, over the last decade, the rise in California rates didn't even keep up with the change in California Consumer Price Index. So it's difficult then to understand when you have 2 years of staggering losses that make companies fundamentally feel like they don't understand the risk that they have in their portfolio. What are they supposed to do? I think generally people understand homeowners insurance is going to be more expensive moving forward, but asking a question about shouldn't you give a discount off of already grossly inadequate rates, that's a tough discussion to have. And we are also under pressure all the time to use the pricing signals that we have in our toolbox to signal the risks people face, particularly climate risk. And so we are a bit whipsawed because we are under pressure to provide suppressed rates, but and then that masks the signal of the true risks that people face. And so 2 or 3 years ago, I wasn't in regular conversations with environmentalists or with resource specialists, and now we are. Because there's a lot of interest in having the insurance system be sort of a leading indicator of the risks people face so that there can be proper capital allocation at that point. If we mask those signals through, let's say, rate suppression, then we get a whole bunch of results that people say they don't want.
Okay, well, I've been treating Rich like my Marianne Williamson on the debate stage here. So we'll start with you on our lightning round. Short-term, long-term, what would you like to see if you had a magic wand?
Short term, in the next year, we need to increase pace and scale of building shaded fuel breaks around vulnerable communities. Fuel breaks won't necessarily stop a fire. It does give a place to fight a fire, and it's part of the thinning that we need to do anyway, and we might as well start in the most vulnerable places. I do that in the first year. Longer term, I think we need to change the paradigm in our thinking about this. And recently I realized that when I was in the state legislature, I represented a district that on one side was bounded by the Pacific Ocean and on the other side by San Francisco Bay. 10 years ago, I started work on sea level rise as an impact and result of climate change. And one of the things we learned from that is that there's certain places where you have to do armoring. You got to build a higher levee wall around the San Francisco airport. There's certain places where you need to retreat. Move back, let the marshes be restored. And there's also certain places where you build differently and retrofit. Facebook has their campus right on the shore of San Francisco Bay. Every new building they're putting in place, the whole first floor is parking. The building starts on the second floor. They're preparing for sea level rise. We need to take that model of thinking about armoring, retreating, retrofitting, and apply it to what we now know is another phenomenon of climate change, and that's what's happening in our forests, in our vegetated communities. It's the higher humidity, or lower humidity and higher temperatures impacting us, and we need to deal with this impact of climate change.
Thank you. Laurie.
In 1 year, I would start a program of investment at the $1 billion+ level to prepare California's landscapes better for climate change and fire resilience, and make that part of a 25-year effort that we were putting people to work restoring the resilience of these landscapes, and at the same time dealing with a number of the other issues that we have with climate change, like water scarcity and water unreliability, so enhancing our water security from our watersheds. 4 of last year's mega fires were in the 7 million acre that is the primary watershed for this state. So we really need to do that for multiple benefits, for fire, for water, for wildlife, and for our own safety.
Thank you.
What I would do over the long term is change land use patterns and where we allow development to occur and where we encourage it or not.
Never a controversial issue.
I know.
Brian.
I think first would be across the state, safe staffing for fire departments. When we respond to wildfires or these master mutual aid incidents across California, most municipalities through the OES system respond with 4. But at home, we respond with 3. Personnel. The second piece, and for me it would be a toss-up, if I had a magic wand, every single utility in this state would be brought up to a gold standard of safety in their components and their machinery, but also in their maintenance schedule. The other one that I'm pretty passionate about is we have got to target our most at-risk area and do some very aggressive vegetation management in these areas to build ecologically sound buffer zones in these communities. So those are three things from me.
Thank you, Brian. Rex?
Well, certainly in the short term, what we are hoping for as non-environmental experts is more of a consensus among the environmental community about what are tools for fuels reduction that fit within sort of California's values of environmental protection. It is a little confusing sometimes to listen to the various environmental groups that are all, you know, household name groups, and they say very different things when it comes to what we should be doing for fuels management. And so we certainly would encourage more consensus there so that we can agree on what is a way we can move forward with bona fide fuels management, because the types of fires we see now versus 10 years ago, they're different. They're hotter. They're getting way up into the trees. They propagate with alarming speed, and the type of damage they do is shocking. You see foundations cracking today that 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you just didn't see those types of losses. So something has changed, and the ferocity of these fires has changed, and obviously that dramatically impacts insured losses, which affect everybody.
Thank you, Rex. And finally, Patrick.
An educational master plan for the next decade, including high schools and higher education, of what jobs are going to be needed to deal with climate change, wildfire suppression, the environmental analysis to it, more firefighters. It's, you know, what are our jobs and how can our high schools and higher education system meet that? And maybe some front money to look at that.
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking out at the audience, and they're telling me they need the restroom and they need to refill their coffee. Don't forget there are keys to the restrooms on your way out the door, and the restrooms are down to your left as you exit. Please join me in thanking the panel.